Hi everyone, my name is Alex. I am from the eastern part of the Europe. If more specifically from the Chisinau, it's actually a small city in a small country called Moldova. And right now I have a goal to get a job at Google. And to be honest, I never really dreamed about working there before because I always thought it's almost impossible. But recently I decided that I actually want to try and make it happen. So, as far as I know, the Google interview process consists of several stages, and one of the most important ones is solving algorithmic problems. And again, honestly, I'm not very strong at them right now because the last time I seriously studied algorithms was at university. That's actually the reason why I'm starting this channel, so I can track my process over time and make sure I don't give up on what I have already started. And my main motivation is a friend of mine, also named Alex, who managed to pass all the interviews and now is working at Google. So let's get started and try to achieve this goal. So first of all, let's check the first example and what we are given. And we are given an array of numbers, nums, and a number target. And we need to find two indices, I and j, such that nums I plus num j is equals to target. And we need to return these indices. We'll all have an example where we have an array nums with values 2, 7, 11, and 15, target, which is equal to 9, and output should be 0 and 1. Why so? Because the index of 2 is 0, index of 7 is 1, and 7 plus 2 is equals to our target, which is 9. And before we even start to write any code, let's first of all give ourselves some questions. You may think a little bit about these questions, but I will answer them now. What questions? What we are given? What do we need to find? Are there any limitations that you have noticed? So, for the first question, the answer will be what we are given: an array of integers and a target some value, which means that our method will have two parameters. The first parameter will be an array of integers, and the second parameter will be an integer, our target. What do we need to find? The indices of the two numbers that in sum will give us target, which means that our method should return an array of integers. And are there any limitations that you have noticed? In that case, I have noticed that we can't use the same elements twice, which means, for example, let's imagine that our target is 4 and our first element is 2. And in that case, we cannot return index 0, 0, because the idea of that exercise is to return two different elements. So this solution will not be correct. Now let's try to make a solution for the first task, and let's create a method. We actually already identified that our method should return an array of integers. That's it. And also let's give our method a name. Let's say to sum. And we also already identified that our method should have two parameters. The first parameter will be an array of integers, and the second one will be an integer, our target. Cool. Because we will need to iterate through all our array, we will need to use a loop. For that, we can use for. Inside that for, we can create a current, an internal actually variable, which will store the current element. And because we will need to compare that current element with other elements from our array, we will need to create the inner loop. And because we don't want to compare the current element with itself or with other elements through which we already passed through, it's better to do something like that. Cool. Now we can use the if statement in order to check if the current element plus element from the inner loop is equals to our target. And if it is, then we can return an array with two indexes. One will be the index of the current element and another will be the index of the element from the inner loop. If we will not find a solution to that moment, it means that we don't have any elements in our array which will give us our target. And in that case, we can return an empty array. And now let's check the solution. Now let's check the solution and let's think if it can be improved. And first of all, let's answer to some questions. And you may think about the answers for a couple of seconds. And let's check what kind of questions. Since the solution uses a nested loop, the time complexity is O(n squared). Can this be improved? Is it possible to get rid of internal cycle? Maybe it's worth using map here. If map can help, what will be the key and what the value? And I can give you an answer for all these questions. So yeah, it can be improved. We can use a map in order to avoid internal cycle. And like a key, we will use an element for which we already passed, and the value will be the index of that element. Why it's important that complement, in our words, to be a key? Because we will search by the key, yes? And when we search by a key, the complexity is O(1), and when we search by a value, the complexity is O(n). Now let's check the potential solution. So we will need to iterate through the array once. For each element, we will need to calculate complement, which is equals to target minus current element. And then we will need to check if the complement is already in the map, and in case if it's not in our map, then we will need to add it, or if it is, we just will need to return the index which is for that complement. And now let's make a solution for that. Let's create a method. Let's name it like DoSomeImprovement. And here we will need a map where we will store elements, or in other words, complement, for which we already passed, and indexes. Now we will need a loop we can use for in order to iterate through our array once. Now let's calculate the complement for each iteration. Now we will need to use an if statement in order to check if this complement is already in our map. If it is, we can return an array with index for that complement and index for current iteration. If it's not, then we will need to add the current element in our map and index for that element. If we haven't found any solution till that moment, then we can return an empty array or null. Now let's go and check the solution. Okay, let's proceed and let's check the next exercise and what we are given. And we are given an array of numbers, and we need to return true if the array contains at least one duplicate number, and false if all numbers are unique. And we have two examples. In the first example, we have an array with values 1, 2, 3, 1, and in that case we need to return true, because we have a duplicate, it's 1. And in the second case, we have an array with numbers 1, 2, 3, 4, and in that case we need to return false, because in this situation we don't have any duplicates. And now let's answer to some questions before even start writing any code. And what kind of questions, you may ask? What are we given? What do we need to return? What does duplicate mean in the context of this problem? You might think a couple of seconds to answer to this question, but let me answer them now. So what are we given? An array of numbers, which means that our method will have an argument, an array of integers. What do we need to return? True if there is at least one duplicate, otherwise false. What does duplicate mean in the context of that problem? A number that appears more than once in the array. So it will help you to understand better this task. Now let's try to implement the solution, and let's create a method. So we already identified that our method should return a boolean. So let's do it. Let's call our method HashDuplicate. And we also already identified that our method should have one argument, an array of integers. Now we will need to create a for because we want to iterate through each element from our array. Okay, now let's create a current variable where we will store the current elements of this loop. Alright, now let's create an inner loop in order to compare each element with the current element. And we already know that in case not to compare with the same elements or with elements through which we already passed, we can do something like that. Let's add an if statement where we will check if the current element is equal to element from the inner loop. If it's true, it means that we have a duplicate in our array and we can return true. If we haven't found any solution till that moment, then we can return false, which means that we don't have any duplicate in our array. And now let's check how the method works. Okay, now let's analyze the solution and let's think if it can be improved. And let's answer to the next questions. Since the solution uses a nested loop, the time complexity is O n squared. Can this be improved? Is it possible to get rid of internal cycle? Maybe it's worth using a set here. If set can help, what will be stored inside it? The value or the index? And let me answer to these questions. And the answer is that yes, we can improve it. We can use a set and it will help us to avoid internal cycle. And in the set, like a value, we will not store the index, but we will store the value because we want to compare by value. Now let's check the potential solution. So the logic is that we will need to iterate through the array once. For each element, we will need to check if the current element is already in the set. If yes, then we have found the duplicate and we can return true. If no, then we need to add the current element in the set and to move on. Now let's check the potential solution and implementation. So let's create the method. We will need to create a set where we will store all elements through which we already passed through. Also, we will need a loop in order to iterate through our array. In that case, I will use for each because I don't need index. Also, we will need an if statement in order to check if the current element is in our set. If it is, then we can return true because it means that we have found duplicate. If no, let's add in our set the current element. And if we haven't returned true till that moment, it means that we don't have any duplicates and we can return false. Now let's check the solution. Okay, now let's check the next exercise, and here we are given two strings, word1 and word2, and we need to return true if word2 is an anagram of word1 or false in our case. And here we have two examples where we have word1 equal to anagram, word2 equal to anagram, and in that case we need to return true because all the characters are the same with the same frequency. And we have another example where we have red and where we have car, but the problem is that word 1 doesn't have the character C. So let's answer the questions. What is an anagram? What are we given and what do we need to return? What do we need to check to know if one string is an anagram of the other? And let's answer these questions. What is an anagram? A word formed by rearranging the letters of another word using the same letters. What are we given and what do we need to return? We are given two strings, word 1 and word 2. We need to return true if word 2 is an anagram of word 1, otherwise false. And here we can notice that our method should have two arguments and both will be strings. What do we need to check to know if one string is an anagram of the other? Check that both strings have the same length and the same characters with the same frequency, which we already seen in the condition. And in our method, we can notice that we will need to have a validation. Okay, let's check the potential solution. Let's create our method. Here we already noticed that our method should return boolean. And also it will have two arguments and both will be strings. Now let's add the validation, where we will check if word 1 is the length of word 1 is not equal to the length of word 2. In that case, we will return false, because it means that it's 100% these two words are not, it means that word 2 is not anagram for word 1, because the frequency of characters are different. Okay, cool. Now let's decompose our strings in char arrays. Now let's sort both arrays because we want them to have same order, and it will allow us easy to compare them. Okay, now let's compare them. If they are equal, we will return true, and if not, we will return false. And now let's check the result. Okay, now let's analyze the solution and answer to common questions. Since the solution use sorting and in Java sort method use quick sort algorithm, the time complexity is O n log n. Can this be improved? Is it possible to avoid sorting altogether? Maybe it's worth using a map here. If map can help, what will be the key and what the value? The character or its count? So let me answer to this question. So yes, we can improve this algorithm. We can use map. It will help us to avoid sorting method. And like a character, we will store the elements, and the value will be frequency of that element, which is a character from our word. Okay, now let's check the potential solution. And the idea here is that we will need to iterate through word 1 and to create a map where we will store like a key the character, and the value will be the count, or in other words, frequency of this character. Then we will need to iterate through word 2 and to check for each element if they are present on the map. If yes, then we will increase the count by 1. If no, then we will return false. If we check in the map and the character is not present there, we can return false. Or if the value is not equal to 0, it means that the character is present but the frequency is different. And if everything is 0, then we can be happy, and it means that the word 2 is an anagram and we can return true. So now let's check the solution and let's implement our method, which will be improved method. Here we will need to use an if statement and to check if length of both words are not different, because if they are not the same, we can return false and to avoid unnecessary calculation. Now we create a map where we will store all characters from first word and the frequency of this word. Actually, not frequency of the word, but frequency of the character in this word. And now let's create an array of character from our word. In the next step, we will use for each, because we don't need index, and for each character from our word, we will put it in our map and also include like a value the frequency of each character. Here I will use get or default, which means that if character is present, we will return its value. If not, we will put at default value 0. It helps me to avoid unnecessary code here. And now let's create the same. Let's create the array of characters for the second word. Now let's create a for each in order to iterate through the second word. Here we will need to use an if statement in order to check if in our map of characters from the first word, the current character from the second word is present. If it's not present, we can return false and avoid unnecessary calculation. Here we can return false because we already know that if the character is not present, it means that word 2 is 100% is not anagram of word 1. Next, let's put in our map the current character and let's decrease the frequency. Okay, now we will need to iterate through our map and to check if all values are equal to 0. If yes, then we will return true. If not, we will return false. Here you can notice that I have done a mistake. Here is false, but actually here should be true, because if we passed through the previous validation where we have used if, then everything should be okay and we need to return true. So let's check the next exercise. And here we are given an array of characters, and our task is to reverse this array in place, which means that we don't need to create an additional array. And below we have an example where we have an array with characters hello, and we need to get Oleg. So I think the task is simple, we just need to reverse the array. And let's answer to our questions. Let's see what kind of questions. What is given and what needs to be done? What does in place means? For the array hello, which elements should be swapped and in what order? So let's give an answer for these questions. So, what is given and what needs to be done? We are given an array of characters and we need to reverse it, which means that our method should take like argument an array of characters. What does in place mean? In place means modifying the original array directly without creating a new array. And this also means that we will need to return the array, which was like a parameter, because in Java we send not by value but by address. And for the array hello, which elements should be swapped and in what order? For array hello, we need to swap the first and last element h and o, then swap the second and second to last element e and l. And the middle will remain in place. So now let's create our method. So we already identified that we will need to return an array of characters. Let's call our method reverse string. And also we already identified that the parameter for that method should be an array of characters. Because we will need to iterate through our array, we will need a for. But here is one important thing, because we don't need to iterate through all our array, because it will lead that we will reverse our array twice, we need to divide the length by 2. Okay. Now our main goal is to revert it. And how we can do it? So we can change the first element with the last, the second with the second to last, and so on. So for that we can create a temporal variable where in the first iteration we will store the first element. Then we will change the place where the first element was stored with the last element. And then we will put in the place where the last element was stored the first element from our temp variable. And after that, we will return our array. And you can notice that in this solution, we haven't created any additional arrays. And we have returned the array, which was the argument of our method. Again, in Java, we send arguments not by value, but by address. And now let's check how this method is working. So let's analyze the solution. So the time complexity is O(n). We iterate through half the array, but it's still linear. And the space complexity is O(1). We swapped in place, no extra array created, and only one temp variable, which is fine. So the solution looks great, and we can leave it how it is. So now let's check the last task for today and what we are given. We are given two sorted arrays, nums1 and nums2. The task is to merge them into a single sorted array in place, meaning the result should be stored in nums1. Nums1 has enough space to hold all elements with a total size of m plus n, where m is the number of actual elements in nums1 and n is the number of elements in nums2. Extra space at the end of nums1 are filling with zeros. And below we have an example where we have nums1 with elements 1, 2, 3, 0, 0, 0, and m is equal to 3, nums2 is equal to 2, 5, 6, and n is equal to 3, and result is 1, 2, 2, 3, 5, 6. So we can see that in the end we just need to have a sorted array stored in our nums1. So now let's answer to our questions. What is given and what needs to be done? Why does nums1 have extra zeros at the end? And for arrays nums1, which is equal to 1, 2, 3, 0, 0, 0, and nums2, which is equal to 2, 5, 6, what should the result look like? And the answers are: what is given and what need to be done? We are given two sorted integers in an array of integers, nums1 and nums2, and we need to merge them into one sorted array in place inside nums1, which means that our method will have four parameters, two arrays of integers and two ints. Why does nums1 have extra zeros at the end? Those empty slots, zeros, served space for the elements for nums2 to be placed into nums1. For arrays 1, 1, 2, 3, 0, 0, 0, and nums2, 2, 5, 6, what should the result look like? The result should be an array, sorted array, and all elements from both arrays merged and sorted inside nums1. So I hope that helped you to understand better what we need to do. And now let's create our method. And we actually already identified that our method should return an array of integers. Let's call our method merge sorted arrays. And like arguments, we will have two arrays, array1 and array2, and two integers, m and n, where m is number of real elements in array1 and n is number of real elements in array2. Now let's create three local variables. The first one will be I, which is equal to index of the last real element from the array1. The next will be j, and this is the index of the last real element from the second array, array2. And the last variable, k, which will store the index of the last element, actually the index of the last place from our array1. And now let's create a loop, because we will need to iterate through our arrays, and we don't know how many times we will need to do that, so we will need to use while. And the condition will be j higher or equal to 0, because if j is less than 0, it means that we have already copied all elements from the array2 inside our array1, and we can stop our loop. Now we will need to create a condition using if statement, and it will be from two parts. The first part will be I higher or equal to 0, and we will need this because we want to be sure that we are still inside our array, and when we will decrement our I counter, that it will not be equal to -1. And the second one, we will need to check if the last real element from the array 1 is higher than the last real element from the array 2. If yes, then we will need to place the last real element from the array 1 to the end of the same array. And also we will need to decrement I counter. In case if the last element from the array 2 is greater than the last real element from the array 1, then we will need to place this element, the last real element from the array 2, to the end of the array 1. And also we will need to decrement j. And for both cases we will need to decrement k, because we already know what element should be at the end of our array 1. And in the end, let's return sorted array. And now let's check how the method works. Now let's check our solution. The time complexity is OM plus n. We iterate through both arrays only once. Each element is visited exactly once. And space complexity is O1. We merge and place directly into array 1. No extra array is created. So the solution looks great and we can leave it how it is. Now let's check what data structures and algorithms we have used to solve our problems. And for the first task, toSum, we have used HashMap data structure. For contains duplicates, we have used HashSet data structure. For valid anagram, we have used frequency counter pattern. For reverse string, we have used two pointers pattern. And for merge sorted arrays, we again have used two pointers pattern. So congratulations and thanks for watching this video till the end.